afternoon, everybody. Hopefully people can hear me. Just give me a quick wave if you can. Great, lovely, brilliant, perfect. Well, here we are at the final keynote speech of EAPRIL 2021. Thank you all for joining this session, and it is my greatest pleasure to introduce you to this afternoon, Anastasia Sergeeva from the Universiteit of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, who is going to talk to us this afternoon about conceptions and misconceptions of digitalization for learning in organizations and workplaces. And it's our greatest pleasure to have you with us this afternoon, Anastasia. And I would like to give the floor to you, following which we will have a short questions and answers if you're happy, and if people can use the function as usual to raise their hands if they have any questions for Anastasia after she's finished her talk. Anastasia, over to you.
Thanks so much. Just let me quickly try sharing my screen. And let me know if everything is fine. You can see it? Yeah?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, thanks so much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Welcome, everyone. This is a talk on workplace learning in digital age, where I'm going to share with you some of the insights from multiple case studies I have conducted in organizations that are adopting new or emerging technologies. So I'm an ethnographer of work and organizing, and especially work and technology. So I'm interested in how people engage with new technologies in the workplace, what happens when they do so, how the work is changing, what's the nature of work or changing nature of work as we talk about it. And so I'm interested in the topics of learning and education, mostly from that organizational angle, which might be a bit an unconventional angle in relation to the topics that have been discussed in the past few days here in this community. But in many of the cases I have followed myself, and together with the students of mine, I have seen multiple implications for skill acquisitions, for professional development, for how to prepare for the digital age, both in the workplace, but maybe also in an educational realm. So hopefully these insights will be informative or inspiring for you as well. And maybe we can reflect together on how this relates to the topics of interest for this community as well. So speaking about the future of work or the changing nature of work, this is an area in which I'm specializing in. If you follow that discourse and these topics a little bit in the media or in the public realm or in the consulting realm or governmental kinds of discussions, there is a lot of interest in how the workplace of the future has to adapt to the emergence of multiple digital tools or digitalization or digital transformation. And you see reports published by all kinds of actors and stakeholders, including McKinsey, for example, Boston Consulting Group, but also governmental organizations, World Economic Forum, so all educators as well, workers unions. Many people are interested in these topics from angle of well-being, angle of remote work, angle of job destruction and things like that. So you see a huge explosion of reports focusing on those topics. This is, for example, the Boston Consulting Group reports speaking of digital technologies eliminating millions of jobs, but creating new opportunities, and reflecting on what are the implications. And if you look across those scenarios and forecasts and this kind of reflections, what I argue is typical to them is taking this so-called macroeconomic view or labor economics view that is very nicely exemplified in this kind of forecasting tool. For example, maybe you have seen it at some point. This is a kind of calculation tool developed by economists from Oxford University, talking about how likely a particular job category is to be replaced by automation, computerization, or robotics. And they give you a kind of a nice sort of a illustration that you can type a particular occupation here in this tool, and they will give you a certain percentage, how likely it is that this job is going to be obsolete in several years. And you see here that, for example, accountants and auditors have the likelihood of almost 100% to be automated in the next 2 decades. But the dentists, on the other hand, or recreational therapists are relatively safe from automation. So another example here is this World Economic Forum recent report that was published recently that gives a bit of a similar take on these questions about the skills, the top skills that are important for the workplace of the future now. And some of the key insights from that report I take here just to illustrate the kind of rhetoric that is implicit in this kind of conversation. They talk about, for example, the number of jobs that are destroyed will be surpassed by the number of jobs created, but the job creation is slowing while destruction is accelerating, and that is all caused by digitalization. And that quite a big percentage, almost 100% of business leaders report that employees need to pick up new skills on the job, which is almost half of the increase from the previous years. The share of core skills needs to change, and a lot of employees will need reskilling. So these kinds of speculations and these kinds of scenarios are what characterizes most of those conversations. And what is inherent and important about these discussions, and what is important also to reconsider, and hopefully I can illustrate that from with the cases that I will present today, is that these ideas that these angles are taking on technology and the nature of skill tends to oversimplify this concept of automation and the concept of skill in the workplace. And that leads us to overestimate the fear of unemployment and the fear of what needs to be done with our skills, and that's also connected to this kind of an uncritical or a bit of a distant view on what the technology in question actually is. So it takes this position of technology being an independent force that lands somehow from top down to employees that have to adapt to it without recognizing the ways people engage with technology, the creative ways or adaptations that they may take towards that technology in the workplace. And that also sort of has implications for how we think about reskilling or upskilling, and how we prepare our scenarios for adapting the workplace to the future, because it focuses a lot on individuals, takes this technology for granted. Most of the scenarios talk about digital literacy that we need to sort of develop in employees, and that's sort of the stopping point, and that's very individualistic view on workplace learning that may miss important lessons learned if we actually took a look at the workplace itself and immerse ourselves over there. So over the years, I have been studying multiple cases to sort of dig deeper in what's going on in the workplace with these new technologies. And I have studied it across multiple settings and multiple domains. Some of the examples include here, for example, the introduction of patient data portals into the work of physicians in healthcare. I've studied the introduction of this intraoperative MRI equipment into the work of brain surgery to look how surgeons that allowed brain surgeons to scan their patients without moving them out of the operating theater, just right on the spot in where they could perform their operations. I have studied the introduction of predictive policing into the work of police officers in the Netherlands, deep learning algorithms in hiring for hiring purposes, and also the surgical robotics. So I will just zoom into some of those cases today to illustrate what we can learn if we really look inside the workplace, and if we see how what people learn and what are the skills and what do they do when the technology actually comes into their work practice. So some few words about the method or the approach that I'm taking that I argue is very revelatory if we talk about this digitalization or workplace learning in particular in this particular case. And the approach is so-called ethnographic approach. That's both a method but also a bit of an epistemological commitment. So the basic idea about how do we believe we can produce meaningful knowledge or useful knowledge for practice. And it might be familiar to some of you because it has some parallels, for example, with participatory research, but it is a bit different though, especially from action-oriented research. And ethnography, as some of you may know, has originated mostly in cultural anthropology, but also has been employed in sociological studies a lot to study various communities or various cultures. And traditionally, the origins of anthropology was, of course, with kind of Western thinkers going abroad, very far away in sort of exotic islands to study tribal cultures that are very, very distant and very different from how our Western culture is operating, in order to immerse into the ways of living of those particular tribes and try to understand how what are the social forces or what are the social norms and the guiding frames that are sort of sustaining those communities and how they function, basically. And ethnography is still not a mainstream type of an approach for generating knowledge about social reality. It's a bit niche still, although it's gaining more and more legitimacy, at least in the organization studies where I'm working. And it requires and actually insists on this idea that we can only generate meaningful knowledge if we spend enough time, a very prolonged kind of time and engagement with the informants, with the setting, with the people that are acting in a particular place, in this case, in particular organizations. And it asks a researcher to suspend all kinds of assumptions about what we think is good, what we think is bad, how things are working, but actually be open and generate the thickest possible description about this particular community or this particular culture in order to sort of inform yourself and understand what the social reality is consisting of. And in terms of technologies, it has been proven very useful because it is kind of a critical commitment or critical approach to technology without sort of being led by the hype description of what this technology might do, but instead letting us be open to see how it is employed in the workplace, how it's improvised, and whether it's good or bad, and for whom, and what matters in this particular cases. So, and to illustrate that kind of what we can gain if we take this ethnographic approach, this robotic case, or the case of the Da Vinci surgical system, I think is very illustrative, with which I will start. And some of you may have seen or may be familiar with this kind of technology that provides this three-dimensional immersive kind of environment for surgeons to operate on patients, sort of in some way, in some sense, they are operating at a distance, although they're still required to be situated in the same room as the patient by legal requirements. And it looks like this, like I'm illustrating this on this particular slide, where the surgeon is immersing himself into the console and puts his fingers on certain joysticks that the console provides. And while he's pressing his head into this console, what he sees is a visualization of the patient's anatomy that is transmitted by the camera that is inserted into the patient's body, that you see here on the operating table. And his movements, the movements of his fingers are sending the signal to the instruments that are inserted in this trocars above the patient, and this way he can actually perform any manipulations that are needed into on the patient. He can also switch the pedal in order to switch between several instruments at the same time, so he's capable of operating up to 5 arms, so-called arms, at the same moment, without having to rely on an assistant or a student that would otherwise lend a helping hand to the surgeon to perform that procedure. So there are multiple discussions about this kind of system in terms of benefits that it brings for patients, in terms of operative outcomes, and in terms of also adoption decisions. And if you look throughout the discussions and publications on the topic of the Da Vinci surgical system, what you see very often is the focus on the surgeon as the focal recipient of that technology. So you would see, for example, publications or media coverage or just reflection pieces on questions like how likely is the surgeon to adopt the robot? Do they like the robot or not? Which kind of surgeons are more open to this kind of innovative techniques? Acquisition of skill is an extremely important topic in this kind of conversations. So how, what is the learning curve of new, of surgeons who are picking up the skill, and how we can educate them? So these are sort of the main questions that occupy public awareness. And what I found is that there is almost no attention to the effects of the adopting the surgical system, the robotic system, on the rest of the surgical team, which includes the nurses, anesthesiologists, but also residents, surgeons who are participating in the performance of surgery. And I have studied this, the implementation of the Da Vinci robot in one of the hospitals here, and I followed all teams that have actually experienced working with this system, and that has been around 10 teams in total. And I have interviewed everyone who has ever had any kind of exposure or more regular experience with working with the system. And I must say it is now very well adopted and is used regularly and routinely in the hospital that I'm studying. So it's quite a successful story in terms of adoption, if you ask me. And what is interesting, that the question of acquiring skills in terms of mastering this console across the surgeons was by far the least problematic issue in all the stories I heard and what I had seen them do in practice. So the technology was very user-friendly, very intuitive to use. They reported a lot of fun and actually ease of use in terms of acquiring or getting used to the console. What was very important, though, for this Da Vinci robot to be employed in practice and sort of become institutionalized and become embedded into the practice of the team, was the figuring out how to adapt the roles of every team member that is involved in the performance of surgery to this new configuration. So what you see here is that the traditional setup of the performance of surgery involves all these people, including nurse, surgeon, residents in training, anesthesiologists, standing around the patient's body. And now that the surgeon goes away and sits in the corner of the room, he's separated from the rest of the team and also acquires a lot of new capabilities in order to perform kind of manipulations that he needs to, but he also has a lot of reductions in terms of being separated, not being able to oversee what the team is doing, not being able to hear what is going on. And that leads to a lot of changes that the whole team experiences, but also has to adapt and figure out in terms of how to still ensure the same and safe performance of surgery in these new conditions. What we have seen is that this kind of separation and this kind of new ways of working, that this technology leads to multiple implications for every member, including, for example, the students in training. You see here on the picture, who traditionally learn by standing next to the surgeon, observing what he is doing, helping him by, for example, holding a tissue or cutting little things. And this vicarious learning is sort of an unaware way method for acquiring the skill. And now when the surgeon is alone in the console, the only thing that is left for them to do in the beginning was to still stand at the table. But what we have found is that they found it to be sort of an uninspiring work. So what they did is that they moved away from the table in order to sit closer to the surgical action and actually observe what is going on inside the patient's body by looking at the screen. What it also led to is that when the residents went away from the operating table, the only actor and the only person who stayed next to the patient was the assisting nurse, the scrub nurse, that had to still oversee what is going on with this robotic arms. And that, if you see here, it's quite a big construction and a lot of mess. Well, it's not mess, very sterile, but there was still a lot of work to do remaining at this operating table. And the nurses eventually had to take over a lot of the tasks that were in the realm of the surgical domain that the students actually performed, but now no longer were available to do so, and which led to acquiring a lot of the surgical knowledge and the surgical skill in the nursing profession, which we found that they also very much enjoyed, because it required them to learn the anatomy more, to take up more important responsibilities, to upskill themselves, and sort of stop referring to themselves as helpers or support of the surgeon, but actually imagine themselves as an independent profession. We found also that anesthesia had to adapt a lot to this new configuration, because with the absence of the surgeon in the middle of the team and being sort of the overseer and the team leader in the center of action, now they had to take on additional responsibilities that related to safety of the patient, for example, that they had to ensure that, for example, the cushions behind the patient's head or the way the patient is positioned is not interfering with any kind of equipment, is not creating danger for any vitals, which usually tended to be within the domain of surgeons, but now had to be redistributed to the anesthesiological profession. So in sum, we have seen that this move from this very traditional performance of surgery that relied on this collocation, proximity, where everybody can see who is doing what, everybody knows who is doing what. This is a very rigid and very clear division of responsibilities and tasks that is characteristic of the medical field, where it's a very highly professionalized setting where you need to have these rigid rules. That moving towards this other performance that is augmented by robotic technology involves a lot of this emergent experimentation and a lot of adaptation that was not anticipated by any of the people at the start who actually introduced this technology. So what I have found over these 2 years, this was a process where many of those teams had to reconfigure and reimagine their roles in this new setup. They need to develop these new relationships. They need to decide among themselves how they would depend on each other. So who will have which kind of responsibility in order to accommodate this new actor and this new capabilities that the surgeon started to have, which included both augmentation, but also some reductions in terms of peripheral vision. So, and another domain or another example of similar reconfigurations or similar process of discovery comes from a bit of a different domain. Actually, a completely different domain. This is domain of recruitment and hiring, and technology in question is also very different, but the insights that we see here have some parallels to the robotics case, and hopefully we will see that. And the case is about this deep learning algorithm that is being developed. Actually, it's already developed and being rolled out in an organization where we have followed also the this is actually a bit different of a study. We followed it for 3 years now, together with a PhD student of mine that actually spent time with the company that was developing this algorithmic tool, but also in the company that was implementing this algorithmic tool in order to improve their hiring processes. And the essence of this technology or this deep learning algorithm is based on this idea, and this was a very interesting and nice case because the company that is developing this technology is consisting mainly of very young and very passionate and kind of idealistic type of people and data scientists who were young and freshly graduated from the data science and computer science degrees, who were guided by this image and vision of transforming hiring as we know it. And the idea that they had is to sort of avoid all problems that are inherent in traditional hiring processes, where they said, for example, that traditional HR routines or the ways we hire people is based on typical biases that we have about candidates, and the normal judgments about a person is normally formed within, I don't know, 5 seconds. We see a person and it's based on the appearance, the accent we have, maybe the background, the neighborhood we come from, the university we went to, all these kinds of things. And what they wanted to sort of disrupt or change in this kind of morally corrupt, as they sometimes refer to, practice, is to give people a chance to develop, to sort of demonstrate their full potential. And what they said is that the algorithms that we're employing and the tool that we're developing can allow us to see, you see here in the slogan, for example, I am more than you see, kind of an idea, can allow finally this objective insight into the real capabilities of people without clouding it by the HR judgments or biases that they might have. So they developed this tool that basically consisted of various kinds of tasks and sometimes games that people had to play either on their phone, on a laptop, that would evaluate their, for example, mathematical skills, but also their risk-taking propensity, their emotional intelligence, where they would give you certain tests of particular eye expressions, or showing you little videos, and then you would have to click on whether you think it's you see an emotion of surprise or an emotion of joy or things like that. And after a candidate would play those games and sort of score on each of those dimensions a particular number, then the tool would correlate it with a profile that the company is searching for, and will find or identify the perfect fit for the company. And this initial idea was based on the extreme opposition that the developers of this tool, of this deep learning algorithm, that they had towards the traditional hiring practice. What we found after we have followed this from the beginning of their first pitch and their first negotiation with the company, and the company we studied was a big multinational corporation that is using this tool now for recruiting their trainee, for their trainee program. And we're talking here about 10,000 applicants a year that is that has to be filtered out, that have to be screened in order to get into the program. So it's highly competitive, big volumes of recruitment. This is also one of the reasons for why they were looking for employing these kinds of tools. And in the very beginning, the first pitch and the first ideas were this opposition that you need to transform the practice of hiring by bringing the subjective data towards the field and then getting rid of all the professional judgments. And after they started training the data, and this is also what we have observed, looking at what kind of data they collected, how did they do their correlations, what kind of insights did they get from actually looking at this data and looking at the analytics, and how to identify the best fit. What do managers think about the trainees that are ultimately brought to them by this algorithm, and so on and so forth. Looking through this whole process, which was a very labor-intensive process for both the developers, but also the company that had to work with it in practice, we found that this opposition was quite naive in the beginning, and the whole pitch was very naive, because at each moment in their journey, each moment in time that they had to engage with this company, they stumbled upon this realization of how important it is to learn from HR managers and to incorporate their judgments in order to make sense of whatever this algorithm is producing, and in order to develop that technology further. So for workable technology, they also realized once they started working with it in practice, is that mutual learning is the best strategy for them to go, and it's necessary actually, otherwise it's not going to work. And the things that the developers, or this young very sort of idealistic kinds of data scientists needed to learn from HR boiled down to sometimes basic questions, but also more complicated questions like, for example, what data do we need to gather in the first place? Where to get that data? What makes a good employee in this company? That's a very subjective question, even though in the beginning they thought that they would be able to objectively somehow infer that from their analytics. What defines a good performance? How to make sense of the results of the AI models? Which variables to include? What are desirable variables to include or exclude? And on the other hand, the HR team that was involved into rolling out this kind of technology for their work also learned quite a bit from that whole project and from implementing this algorithm and collaborating together with developers. And the things that they have learned in this process was, for example, uncovering the sources of biases that they used to have in their previous practice. What kind of vision do we want to pursue for our company? What kind of workforce do we want in the future? Do we want to replicate what we have now? What the best performance? Is this what we want? So an example, for instance, was the discovery for them that the best performing people that they had in their company were the people who did not care about the workplace conditions. So the people who would work for 18 hours a day, maybe also on the weekends, people who didn't care about having well-functioning office or well-being, so things like that. And some of the discussions, the very crucial discussions, arose among those teams that they didn't want to include that as an explicit criteria, that the algorithm would filter out all the people who would care about those things. It also triggered a reflection on how we measure performance. What do we want to use as a measure of performance? Are there ways to do it? These are all the things that the algorithm actually exposed to the HR team that they didn't think about before. And the final case that I wanted to share with you today is this case of predictive policing. That is following the introduction of the so-called crime anticipation system that was introduced into the work of police officers here in the Netherlands. And this system in question was developed in-house in the Dutch police and introduced in 2013, but it took quite some time in order for this to also become implemented into the routine, the routines of the organizations. And I think the lessons learned from this case are also resonate with the other cases, because it shows this embedded nature and the dynamics that has to take place in organizations in order for these technologies to become workable, but also adapted to the system in which it is embedded. So the idea behind the system and the way it works is that it focuses on the so-called patterned crimes that occur with a certain pattern, or regular, or connected to certain seasons, for example, and that has to do with things like housebreaking, mugging, or car theft. And the system utilizes data that is already inputted in the police reports, but also takes data from geographic and demographical information about certain neighborhoods and feeds them into the system in order to produce a certain algorithmic prediction. And the output in which this algorithmic prediction is being provided is a geographical map together with the indication of so-called hot times. So these particular periods of time during the day in which this particular crime may occur, and it's separated in blocks of 4 hours, and a map with a certain area of 125 square meters. And the interesting thing about this criminal anticipation system was that the idea behind introducing this tool was basically driven by the larger datification movement, the idea that we need to rely on data in order to make more informed decision. We have to stay current with the digitalization movement. That is the rhetoric you see across many of the kinds of the workplaces, but also to utilize our resources better. So if we produce this kind of a prediction that housebreaking is more likely to occur in this particular area, we can send our patrolling resources to this particular neighborhood to surveil and perform more rounds in their car in this particular spot. And after this criminal anticipation system was introduced as a pilot in the first year, what we have seen, and also police have seen this, but we studied that again over several years with an ethnographic approach, where a student of mine spent a lot of time in the office of the police environment, to see how this results of the algorithmic predictions were acted upon, how they were made sense of, and were they taken up, and what did people think about it. What we have seen is that even though the data science department that has developed the system, and that was an in-house system in contrast, for example, to American predictive policing tools that is outsourced to Predpol technology. In the Dutch context, this was a data science department that introduced this tool in practice, but they didn't have a particular plan on how to roll it out, or which people are going to be responsible for working with this technology. Here we saw the initiative of a particular group that used to be called intelligence officers, who took on this as their own task to make this technology relevant for the police, to make sense of the output in practice. And what this group, and traditionally this group used to perform a sort of support kind of responsibilities for the police, like looking up the number of license plate, or making spreadsheet reports, and just working with some existing databases, but they were not particularly influential in the existing hierarchy of the police organization. And because they had the skills of working with databases a little bit, they decided that it's up to them to actually make this technology work. And they took it up and had to engage in a lot of learning, and that learning actually expanded beyond just mastering the interface of the algorithmic technology, but also learning how this whole algorithm functions. What is the input, what is the output, how to make sense of nonsensical output, learning about the domain of data science. They started going to different conferences to educate themselves about the foundation of particular algorithmic tools. And this is an example of how the output looks in practice. And they stumbled very often over the course of the several years, starting from the implementation towards the end, with a lot of problems where the outcomes of the system didn't really make sense. So they would say, for example, the map tells me that there's going to be a lot of car theft in a certain area, but I know that there is a shopping mall in this area, so you cannot park cars here. I do not understand why this algorithm is showing me this junk. And also the algorithm tells me there's going to be robbery at this particular point in time, but it's very unlikely because at this point in time, people are at home. So the housebreaking is not likely to occur. So things like that didn't really that didn't compute for the intelligence officers in the beginning. So they started digging a lot deeper into the data science foundation to educate themselves in order to make sense of this and filter out everything that seemed to be junk or irrelevant. They also had to learn a lot about the domain of the police work, and that was a second step for them in order to sort of integrate this technology into the organization, because in order to bring these predictions and sort of make informed decisions or informed recommendation based on the algorithm, they needed to learn the language of the police. They needed to see what the police will take seriously, what will they understand, what will matter to them, and how to sort of integrate these two domains together. So we call them algorithmic brokers precisely because this learning involved mastering both domains, but also bridging the two domains in order to become sort of an interpreter, but also what we call a broker between the two communities, and to make sure that they all benefit each other. What we've interestingly also found that after mastering the skills and learning both the system, but also the police work, and finding the best and most effective way of how to engage these both communities together, they very unintentionally grew a lot in status and their authority over the police decisions, where unexpectedly the managers of the police started to just trust whatever recommendation this intelligence officers group provided to them, because they thought that if it's based on the algorithm and the system and the data objectively tells us that this is what's going to happen, we trust them. And that in a way sort of created this kind of very interesting dynamic where the technology or the fact that they used a lot of their own expertise in order to make sense of the algorithmic predictions was actually black boxed in this whole story of learning. So that whole story of learning happened within this community, but was not very apparent for the rest of the organizations. So in sum, if we talk about the insights across all those cases, and there are other cases that I have studied and also currently we're doing, and they involve the domain of agriculture and healthcare, so very diverse kinds of workplaces. But I think we can safely sort of summarize and see the parallel across many of those stories, that this learning in digital age and learning on the job is a bit less about the digital literacy or individualistic perceptions or cognitive perceptions, but it's more having to do with figuring out how the existing roles and relationships have to be reconfigured and adapted in order to create a working configuration again. We also see from following this improvisation, as we call it, that in the beginning of introducing technology into the workplace, it's very hard to anticipate what kind of reconfigurations are likely to follow. We really have to look at it in practice and see what actors are doing and how they're adapting to this new capabilities, and what will follow is up to them, and we just have to give them space in order to experiment with this. We also need to recognize this embedded character that goes beyond this individual, beyond one group, an expert group like a surgical group, for example, and recognize that there are ripple effects. They're embedded in this nested system, and that's going to shape a lot of the dynamics that follows after the technology implementation. And if we have to speculate a bit in terms of how to prepare for this kind of unanticipated outcomes, what we think is most effective is to create space for this kind of emergent action to unfold, give maybe possibilities for experimenting, small-scale capabilities for experimenting, in order to see how these reconfigurations are likely to follow, and then embrace these effective outcomes, giving agency and giving power to these workers in order to show how this technology can shape their work to the best possible outcome. So this is all about my cases and my presentation, and I'm very excited to hear your questions or reflections on how that may inform the conversations at the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anastasia, for your inspiring, thought-provoking and detailed address to us this afternoon. Wow, what an interesting subject this is, and how wide it is and how broad. I'm sure there will be questions from the floor. So if anybody does have a question that they would like to raise, please raise your hand, and we will try to spot you for you to speak to Anastasia, please. Okay, so please, question from Tom de Schrijver.
Hi, thank you indeed for your interesting presentation. I have two questions, but I will well, raise one for now. You started your presentation with saying, look, a lot of the concerns about new technology is that it will lead to job losses and so on. You are trying to tell us another storyline, that it leads to other ways of team working, other kinds of interdependencies. And I think you have convincingly shown that, but you haven't brought it back to your initial assumption that it doesn't lead to job losses. And my question is, for instance, in surgical teams, did they become, okay, the composition of the teams and the roles become differently, but did the teams become smaller? Did the HR teams, normally when you are looking for a candidate, you also have more eyes and more different persons who are looking at the candidate? Did the number of persons, now it's an IT or a cyborg or an IT thing, and a person, did less people look at the candidates? So did you see that there is indeed some kind of reduction in the number of teams, or is that not relevant? Or can you say something about that?
Yes, very good question. I think it is a question of scale. And in my cases, of course, we try to follow these people for a long period of time, but it might not be enough of not 10 years, perhaps, that we're following to see those effects. But at least in this beginning stages, which I think is still very informative, like 3 years, we see increase in the workload. For example, in the HR case, there was a lot of additional kinds of tasks that had to be performed, first to filter out and work with the algorithm, to make sense of the algorithm, like for example in the police case as well. The idea was that the algorithm would just straightforwardly inform people where to go, but you see that it's very hard, and in the HR case the same. It's very hard to just take it for granted. You need a person to make sense of it, to translate it. So kind of an adaptation, which normally is associated with the increase of new tasks, and somebody has to take on that task. In the HR case, it was a whole outsourcing company that they hired from Poland in order to screen the algorithm's decisions in the beginning and to make sure that they're not missing out on some random cases, or they would have. For example, in the first rollout of the algorithm in the hiring, what happened is that they ended up with no candidates at all for the so-called job market fair. And then the HR team says, we cannot afford having no candidates because we need to bring, usually they would bring 1,000 to a job market fair. And then we don't have any candidates, so let's go back and see what happened there in the algorithm. And for that, they need people. And for that, they need to sort of go through it and make sense of it. It might be, I could speculate, it might be the setup problems. So the beginner stage, so the first several years. And then once you get to a good functioning system, this task would migrate as well. But we haven't seen the reduction yet. I don't know how long it will take, but definitely the picture is much more complex than these predictions would hold. And this is what I'm trying to make an argument for, that if we want to make those scenarios, we have to include this into our forecasting as well. We might get to the reduction, but that calculation is oversimplifying the picture of, and if we don't take it into our data sets of forecasting, then we're missing all those jobs and all those tasks that are otherwise being created. So that's, I think, my point.
Thank you very much. Any further questions for Anastasia, please, from the floor?
Well, I have another question. It's a completely different question. It's on the methodology. I don't know if you know very well what at the EAPRIL what the participants are, but we also have a lot of young researchers, and you also seem to rely, you are on the one hand advocating a very difficult ethnographical approach in which you need a lot of time and critical thinking and so on, but on the other hand I heard you say that you also rely on young people, PhD students, to observe what's happening. I also felt, and it's a personal feeling, that the eye of the master in the first case was really well developed, and so what kind of tricks or what kind of tips would you give young researchers who would like to adopt, or also their supervisors to adopt an ethnographic approach in order to come to meaningful conclusions? Can you give some advice on it if you would like to adopt that approach also? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, that's a very wide question. I mean, there's a lot of tips that may be gained starting from attending every workshop or every course on ethnography that you may find, and finding a supervisor who is experienced in these methods as well, because it is intense and very hard kind of research to conduct. So for the student, it requires a very close engagement with the supervisor as well. So the student cannot really do it alone. Like, you need a sounding board and a person to constantly discuss this, the insights, field notes, deep engagement, more than by one person, because you would drown in the data. So with my students, and I have so these two cases are already finished, so the students are now graduating and having the defense. I have another one who is now doing the agricultural case, but with them, we almost every week, several times, we would discuss things. I would go to the field with them. I am interviewing together with them, so it's really a team kind of effort. And you cannot give up on, like, you cannot cut corners in this kind of things. Like, you have to really, really dig and push and understand the setting. And we're privileged that we had funding for this kind of research, which is a bit rare nowadays, but getting more and more legitimate. So I think that's why we were successful. We were able to see those things happening, but the students are dedicated. So just keep at it and push. That's my advice. I don't know how to, I mean, read all the books you can on ethnographies and then try to do the same.
Okay, but very simple. Do you ask them every day to have a diary, and you yes?
But that's the basic of ethnography. You write down at the same day everything you have seen. That means you stay up until midnight to write up everything, to have, the level of detail that is unprecedented. It's thousands and thousands of pages of field notes. So it's very labor intensive for the students. And they have to write it up in the same day. And ideally, the supervisor needs to read all the field notes as well and be in the setting for, well, I mean, I did with the students, I didn't spend as much time, of course, because that's just impractical, but you need to have a feeling. You need to see the people, interview some people. And so that's, yeah.
There's another question, so I will leave the...
Thank you, Anastasia. Good advice indeed. Keep pushing, keep digging. Yeah. Comprehensive field notes up until midnight, absolutely. Next question, please, from the floor, from Annika Smits.
Hi, thank you so much for your interesting talk. And it has really interested me also in the ethnographic study. Thank you. I have a question from the Universities of Applied Sciences. Well, especially from mine, which is Windesheim. The question that is often raised currently, and that's a question, well, that's closely related to the start of your talk, is how do we prepare students for the work of the future? And in the Universities of Applied Sciences, we could say digital literacy or competencies are very important. And well, we may think that, but we don't show that in education. On the other hand, we see a strong policy currently to provide students with complex multidisciplinary problems that they can work on. These are open, often complex and wicked problems, because that would be important for the jobs of the future. In a way, I can see that this might align with your findings, because multidisciplinary collaboration certainly seems, well, the reconfiguration of it seems very important when introducing technology. At the same time, in your research, we see how highly specific and specialized the contexts are and the workers, where you show this reconfiguration of team roles and new collaboration. And so what do you think about, do you have any thoughts about this way of preparing, well, sort of throwing them in the deep waters of multidisciplinary problems, and sometimes before so much specialization has taken place? Is this a skill that we can train in general, or is this just what is coming about in a specific situation where you're already doing highly specialized work?
Thanks, Annika. It's a $1 million question, I would say.
Yes.
And I hope to, by the end of my career, have an answer and write a book on that topic. But I can share some of the reflections. I see that it is highly specialized, and the contexts are also highly professionalized, very specific, and they might not apply to other kinds of domains. At the same time, and I used to think that, especially when I just focused on the healthcare, then everything is just explained by the fact that it's healthcare. But then I go to HR, then I go to police, then I go to agriculture, and I feel there are parallels. So you could sort of draw more general conclusions. And what I think is important here, and I'm trying that out also in my classroom when I'm teaching this kinds of topics to students. What I do, I give them cases, a case or a role play that I developed based on specific project that I would just present like this. And I would ask them, how would they act? So just play out certain scenarios of, you know, if you were a manager, if you were a data scientist, or you were an HR manager, just tell me, how would you approach, you know, collaborating with this other group? And then I put them in a certain position and I ask them to engage with each other. And then you immediately see how this, exactly what you say, this multidisciplinary collaboration, or this sort of across boundary spanning capability is something that emerges for them, and then they see that clearly. And that comes through many different cases. It doesn't have to be very specialized, but I think this is a kind of skill to which we're pointing at here. And what I think is also a direction to follow, and that what my research also, because of my ethnographic commitment, I guess, is showing, is that we cannot take, with the technology, with the introduction of new technology, we have to teach people who are especially very enthusiastic and very pro kind of new technological tool or digitalization, that they cannot take the work of the domain for granted. So if you are focusing on, for example, data science informing the work of farmers, you cannot just throw it on the farmers. You have to care about the farmers. So this is a skill we need to develop. You need to engage, like an ethnographer needs to engage with that domain. As a worker or manager or implementer, you need to engage with the domain. And that kind of sensitivity and this kind of importance, and, you know, taking the best out of the knowledge that is already developed in a particular setting is something that we can emphasize in our educational efforts, and then make this workplace of the future sort of contain whatever valuable knowledge we have developed over the years, and keep it, you know, and make it workable together with the new capabilities. That's very generic answer, but hopefully we can sort of develop that in the future.
Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much once again to Associate Professor Anastasia Sergeeva for her keynote session for us today, closing the EAPRIL 2021 conference. Thank you so much, and thank you for the questions from the floor.